Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Christopher Monsieur. I'm a assistant professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. And together with my colleagues, Professor Dill, Bertini, Filiozzi, and Glibi, we co-organized this transportation seminar. So we're very pleased today to have Alison and Wiley from the Oregon Department of Transportation to talk to us today about the Governor's Commuter Challenge. So with that, take it away, Alison.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I'm really pleased to be here. What I do at ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation, I'm a program manager for transportation options. And not a lot of people at ODOT do what I do. And one way that I know that is that out of 4,800 employees, I'm the only one specifically doing transportation options. It'd be really fun to have more people working with me. There are other people who do things related, but I work in the public transit division. And my core work is actually grant management. So I have the pleasure of managing the grants that fund a number of transportation options programs in the state. However, what I'm talking about today isn't my normal grant management, but a project that I did this entire past summer, which was a social marketing project in the Capitol Mall in Salem to get more people to not drive alone to work. And so within the world of transportation, there's not a lot of people who focus on getting people to use carpools, van pools, public transit, biking, and walking. But that's my focus and that's my passion. I love what I do. What I'm going to talk about today is social marketing and how I did the Governor's Commuter Challenge, very much in teamwork with a lot of other people. The way that I tend to present is to go ahead and take some questions and discussion and weave it into the presentation. We can also do a lot more of it at the end, but go ahead and ask for clarification as I talk. There's a lot of wisdom in this room. You all know many, many things that I don't know, and so I'm hoping to learn some things from you as well as you from me. Governor Kulongoski he still has, starting in late May, we started to have discussions with the governor's office. The governor, like many of us, wants to sharply reduce carbon emissions. I'm going to do an overview of the Governor's Commuter Challenge. I'll talk about the principles of social marketing. It'll move forward from there. Okay, so look at Oregon's overall greenhouse gas emissions. More than most states, transportation is contributing to those emissions. Does anybody know why that would be?
Long commute distances?
Actually, not that.
They look at the sea, the ships in the sea.
You have to use the microphone.
Can you hear me?
No, the audience.
Oh, the audience have to use the microphone. Oh. Was there, yeah, go ahead.
Hydropower?
Exactly. Because we have a lot of hydropower in our energy mix, we have some coal, but not as much coal as most states. What that comes down to is our carbon emissions are driven more by our transportation than in other states. So that means that we have higher leverage as we reduce our auto trips. So Governor Kulongoski has said people want choices. Transportation options are about choices. We will provide transportation choices that reduce emissions and save Oregonians money on gas. Does anybody remember what gas prices were back on June 2nd when we started the Governor's Commuter Challenge?
4 something.
4 something is the answer. 409 and then 429 was the highest that we went. To be very, very honest, the success of the Governor's Challenge has a lot to do with the high gas prices. I'll take it. I won't argue with that, having been a big producer for me. The fact that you have to pay for parking in the Capitol Mall was another big reason that we succeeded in the Governor's Commuter Challenge. Paid parking is a very powerful motivator for people to do things other than drive alone. In transportation options, we're always working to help people be able to do things other than driving alone. We did an opening survey. Is everybody here familiar with how you do a pre-test to get a baseline? You have an intervention, also known as a campaign, and then you have your post-test to see the results of what you accomplished. Is that familiar to most people? Okay, that's what we did. we had a pretty darn good-sized group, 8,500 Capitol Mall employees in Salem. And the beauty of the situation is that they're pretty much a captive audience in that you have ways of communicating with them, getting their attention. They're in a compact area. They're paying for parking. There's lots more to it. The campaign was for the whole summer, June 1st till Labor Day. And then we did our post-test. Is anybody familiar with what social marketing is in a general sense? Go ahead, Larry.
Well, social marketing is the this one's not working. Social marketing is the application of marketing ideas to social issues. So in a sense, it says people believe they've been successful in getting people to buy products. How do we use those techniques to get people to buy products and make them participate in socially desirable behavior?
Thank you. Well said. Well said. So in this case, the socially desirable behavior was for people to drive alone less, not necessarily stop it, but to drive alone less, to replace some drive-alone commutes with carpooling, vanpooling, biking, walking, public transit. I hate when it does that. It does that too much. Okay. I'll give this one try, and then I might just bring it without that. Okay. This is ODOT's network, which tends to kick me out. I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the social marketing techniques. The whole goal here is to communicate with people. One of the things that you want to do is give people feedback loops. Actually, if I can show you. Okay, let's not do that. Okay, so in the opening survey, we had 8,500 people who were taking our opening survey. And what we were doing was saying, how are you currently getting to work? What are you doing? We actually took their names. We got a lot of email addresses. We were asking them the past Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, the past 5 days that you came into work, how did you do it? And so they specifically said, I drove alone on Monday, I took the bus on Tuesday, so it was very specific. And what we found was that a lot of people were driving alone, every day. And a number of people were taking the bus, but a lot of people were able to change. And we had the advantage of free bus passes. Does anybody here receive a free transit pass or a discounted transit pass? Discounted. Discounted. Okay. Do you find that this makes you more likely to take the bus instead of drive alone?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Common sense, but very, very powerful. In the Capitol Mall, we have a similar situation. People can get a free bus pass to the Salem area district. So one of the things that we did, we sent out weekly emails. And we had the public information officers forwarding all of these emails to their employees. And we were giving them information, because sometimes just information will help people to be able to do the new behavior. So we were giving them the link. So here's how you get your free transit pass. Here's how you can participate in a carpool. We had set a goal of 500,000 pounds of carbon reduction. To be honest, we didn't know what goal to set. It's very hard to know how much you're going to be able to get people to try a different way of commuting. In the survey, we asked people, how likely are you to be interested in trying something other than driving alone? But before we asked them that at the end of the survey. Before we got to that question, we were doing actually a lot of education within the survey. We were, for example, giving them choices. How much are you currently spending on your commute? Does anybody here know what they're currently spending to get to and from your work and your school, say in a given month? How much are you spending? Have you thought about it? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I know that I do other driving as well, but I spend about $20 per month on fuel, and I have a free pass. So that's what I consider about $20 per month on transportation, but I haven't, I mean, that's just gas costs. That's not insurance or anything like that coupled on. If that makes sense.
Okay, so you have a free transit pass, is that correct? So that means that you're not paying for parking. Correct. And you have paid parking here. So you're spending $20 a month on gas. That's a very low amount. And you're able to do that because you have a free transit pass, which also means no parking. Yes. Congratulations. That's one of the lowest, you know. And the thing is, your dollars can then go for other things. Your dollars are not necessarily going overseas to oil companies, but probably staying more in the local economy. In the Capitol Mall, a lot of people, like me, sad to say, commute all the way from Portland to Salem. That's really a ridiculously long commute. I don't think it's sustainable. The way that I go about it is that I have a really cool carpool, and I found it through Carpool Match Northwest. There's 6 of us. Now, I'm lobbying for 7. We're having a little bit of controversy within the carpool because I think we could handle a 7th member. As it is, we've got 6 people. We carpool down. 2 days a week, I telework in Portland. However, when you look at the carbon footprint and also the dollars, carbon footprint and dollars often travel together. They go up together, they go down together. It would make much more sense for me to not work in Salem. But I love my job. I'm not going to quit it. And we've come up against a lot of this. You know, when it comes to planning, urban planning, civil engineering, you know, development, so much of this, and I'm diverging here for just a minute, but it's a big picture. You know, you can't just break it down and to get that person onto the bus. It depends on how that city was built in the first place. If the city was built compactly, and Portland is built very compactly among major American cities, bus is so much more possible. Transit is so much more possible if you have relatively short distances in between residences and work. Okay, so that was a little bit of a digression. We educated people in the opening survey, and we let them know, basically, by asking them to choose between these different scenarios that might fit them. Most of them are spending $400 a month between their gas and their parking. And then we showed them that in other scenarios, you could spend $100 a month if you were in, say, a 3-person carpool, and then you're also splitting up the parking fees. So I'm very, very realistic that even though my passion is carbon emission reduction, because global warming basically is threatening civilization as we know it, I realize that most people are much more interested in their checking accounts and their wallets than they are in carbon emission reduction. I accept that about people. It's fine. The cool thing, though, is that as you bring down your carbon emission reductions, you spend less. Now, that equation is much more true when you have high gas prices. This past summer, and it was largely a coincidence, but not, we probably wouldn't have leapt into the governor's challenge with so much gusto if we hadn't been facing these really high gas prices. Anyways, we looked at this opening survey. After people did the survey, they came down to their final questions. They had already gone through this process of finding out that there were free transit passes available. There were places that they could find carpools. Biking and walking, you know, mean that you spend less on parking. We then asked them, how interested are you in experimenting this summer with driving alone less, trying a few of these other options? A very high percentage of people said either that they were very interested or they were somewhat interested. Very cool. Must have been about 49% of people said that they were either very or somewhat interested. Maybe 28% said they were not interested. No problem. No problem. In social marketing, I've got a really good book you should know about. Anybody familiar with this book? Oh, Fostering Sustainable Behavior by Doug Mackenzie Moore and William Smith. It's kind of the Bible of social marketing. Okay, it's really clear from this and from other research that if people do not want to change, and they might have really good reasons, maybe they have 5 kids and they're a single parent, they're not going to be getting onto the bus. Every minute is already overtaxed for them. Not a problem. Don't try to get them to change their behavior. There's a whole bunch of people who are interested in trying something different. You focus on those people. You don't antagonize the people who want no part of it. Let them do their thing. You've got all these hundreds of people over here who want to try it. You work with them. Okay. So in order to reach this £500,000 goal, we looked at all the people who were very interested in doing something different. we added up all the miles because we knew how many miles they're commuting to work. And then we converted their miles into pounds of carbon. When you burn 1 gallon of gas, you create 20 pounds of carbon dioxide. So you run the numbers and you come up. So anyway, we took this risk. I mean, it was a risk. So we sort of we staked our claim, and we did this press conference on June 2nd. And the governor announced in the grand chambers, the Capitol building is, I don't know, I think it's grand, sort of majestic. And he went on record to the press saying, we're going to try to reduce our carbon footprint here in the Capitol Mall by 500,000 pounds during the summer. And that would translate into roughly $250,000 of state employees' money not spent on gasoline. And so we knew from the beginning that it was going to be a combination of focus on those gas dollars, because people don't like, losing all their money to gas stations, as well as the carbon emissions. So the whole strategy was to pair those things in people's minds. Okay, so big grand press conference. Now what do you do? Here's my very, very high-tech behavior change technology. These are posters. And they went up all over the couch. Is there a problem, Chris?
No,
You okay?
you can use that thing
Okay.
if you want.
Okay, I'll let you do that. We chose this color not because it's pretty, but because it's eye-catching. And so we had these posters going up all over the Capitol Mall. The public information officers, they're the ones who write all the press releases that go out to the states. Oh, good. Okay. So this, yeah, good. So this was the insert. This is the insert. This is laminated. So what we were doing every week, we were printing out new information and having these get inserted anew. And so if you didn't check your email, we were sending out weekly emails giving people new information, and we were also posting these to get the word out. Public commitment. Major tenet of social marketing is that you want people to make a commitment. Now, verbally is one thing. You could say to me, Alison, this summer I'm going to replace 1 trip every week. I'm going to not drive alone 1 day a week, and I'm going to carpool instead. That's a verbal commitment. Cool. You're more likely to do it than not because you said it to me. However, if you've written it down, if you've gone on public record that you're going to do that, you're much, much more likely to follow through on that. We collected hundreds of public commitments, and it was easy to do. Online, they would click here, they're choosing this, they're committing. Okay, so this is called a prompt. You want to put these in just the right places. The parking garages are good places. You're paying all this money every month to pay for parking, and so one of the inserts that we had was, if you were carpooling instead of driving alone, you'd be saving $200 a month between gas and parking. So that's another example of a prompt.
Did you take into account the vehicle type that people were driving? And
Good
time of
question.
day?
Very good question. Really valid. We thought about it because it's very true that if you're driving a Prius, which half of my carpool, more than half, are hybrids, it's a really different carbon footprint than if you're driving an SUV, and that's a fact. What we figured was that in these surveys, people would not feel comfortable telling us their car type. Plus, their car type, a bunch of people are changing cars all the time. And so we decided to not drill it down that far. But you're correct that it's a very carbon footprint depending on what you're driving. Yeah. Yeah?
What about the time of day driving this versus 4 in the afternoon or 8 at night?
Good question. Really good question. Okay, so to answer that, I'm going to back up and talk about why do we do transportation options in general. Congestion is one of the prime reasons. When you have congestion, it's not just that you and I get irritable and pissed off and late to our meeting because we're sitting in traffic. I mean, maybe that's enough reason, our schedules. The bigger reason is that the state of Oregon's economy, the nation's economy, rests very heavily on freight mobility. The trucks that are driving all around, all those semis carrying all that freight, that's driving our economy. If they can't get places on time, the economy is suffering in ways that are very measurable and very dramatic. So congestion is a prime reason, which is why this gentleman is saying, does it matter? Let me just go to a few more benefits and then I'll answer the question. Carbon emissions are a big reason that we do transportation options. If you do something other than driving alone, you're bringing down your carbon emissions. Another whole reason is health. Has anybody here seen this growing body of research that the more time that you spend butt in seat in a car, the more likely you are to be obese or overweight. There's a sharp correlation. Butt in seat, hours, they increase. It's true for groups. Obviously, you could be a person who spends 10 hours a week in a car and are skinny, but it's a group statistic. You can see where I'm going with this. When we sit more and more, we're less healthy. That drives healthcare costs up, again, in the aggregate as a group. Social equity. If a person does not have to own a car, they're much better positioned in their life to have choices. There's another whole area here. Mobility and access. People need to be able to get to jobs. Whether or not you own a car, you need to be able to get to your work, to get to your school, your childcare, your shopping. The transportation system depends heavily on mobility and access, and you need more than one way of getting there. Cars are going to break down at times. The more different ways you have of getting to a place, the better off the citizenship is and the economy is. We did not count congestion. We did not take it into account. Do you have ideas on how you would do that as you were doing a program like this?
I would imagine you just take average commuter time based on the time of day, given the distances. ODOT keeps track of freeways. ODOT keeps track of freeways. If that, they travel trip check times, and they have an idea of how long people are waiting in traffic. And just take an oversimplification based off the amount of hours and what time of day people go home. If you're going from Salem, obviously, at 4 in the afternoon, you have an idea of how long it's going to take you. So, I mean,
I think you have a good point, and one of the reasons it's a good point is that the more, if you spend time idling, let's say you're going to spend 60 minutes getting from Portland to Salem. That's actually a fairly fast drive. But if you expand that by 20 minutes because you're sitting in traffic, you're actually creating much more emissions as you sit there idling than if you were just going along at 40, 50 miles an hour. You know, people tend to resist. Actually, we didn't get that much resistance. The governor has a moral stature and he has a leadership role, and people were very receptive, and the gas prices had a lot to do with it. We weren't getting huge resistance, so people were on board with the whole concept in general. But we were worried that if we started drilling it down into more and more detail, like what kind of car are you driving, what time of day are you driving, the pushback can really mount. And you're trying to keep people's collaborative, cooperative vibe going on. Yeah. Social norming. Social norming is very powerful. People love to do what their peers are doing. If people, it's been proven in this book, this guy has like dozens and dozens of projects that he's done. He's shown that if you give people the information that 40% of PSU faculty and staff are using their free transit pass, people are more likely to then get on board with their own free transit pass than if they had no idea that 4/10 of your friends and colleagues are doing this. It actually makes people much more likely to get on board. So some of the messages that we're putting in, we wanted people, for example, to take the closing survey. You've got to get a big survey turnout in order to have valid results. We all know about that. So we pointed out to people, as we were telling them to take the end survey, that 5,108 Capital Mall employees took the initial survey in May. That was actually a 60% response rate. How many of you have ever gotten a 60% response rate in a voluntary survey? I was so excited. That's a very high response rate. It not just makes your findings more valid, but the survey itself is an educational and motivational instrument. And so we were getting the message out as well as just gathering this baseline data. Do people know more social marketing techniques? There's feedback loops. There's social norms. There's incentives. I noticed that there's a lot of civil engineers in the room. That seemed like one of the more often stated things. Do civil engineers ever think about incentives? Give me some examples, because I want to talk about what's relevant to you. What are some incentives that are used in the world of civil engineering?
Tax breaks for developers?
That's an incentive for sure. Yeah. More incentives?
But that's policymakers that that's the policymaker incentive, not civil engineers.
Right.
Engineer basically implements the
Okay.
policies.
Okay. Within transportation options, an example of an incentive would be my carpool, for example. We get discounted parking. If we were driving alone, we would be spending, I think it's $64 a month for the garage parking. There's a carpool of 6 people, and we're getting $52 a month. Now, the people in charge have told me they think that the discount should be sharper to create more of an incentive. However, it is an incentive. This is kind of an incentive. How many people here ever bicycle to PSU? Oh, yes. Oh, that's a high percentage.
Today, but it was too cold.
Yeah.
I looked at the temperature. I was like, oh, it's dry outside. I was hoping it was going to be 55.
You know,
40
weather
degrees out.
weather is a big determinant of the bike ped thing. The other big thing is safety. People are much less likely to do the bicycle or walk to school or anywhere if they feel like it's unsafe. I just had breakfast this morning with my girlfriend, Noelle Studer. She's actually the sustainability coordinator here. She is 4 months pregnant and happily riding her bike. And I told her I'm going to write about her in my blog because to me, she's inspiring because pregnant women are naturally a little more vulnerable. And she looked at me, she said, Alison, I'm not even unique. She said, I was like, all these pregnant women are bicycling. And I'm like, wow, Portland is actually unusual. Where am I going with all this? Oh, incentive. Okay, so showers. Showers actually make a big difference. A lot more people will do the bicycle thing if they have a shower facility. How many of you could take a shower after you, say, walked 2 miles or biked 6 miles to PSU? How many of you could take a shower if you wanted to? Reasonable. How many of you wish you could take a shower? How many of you have coworkers or students who wish you could take a shower? That was silly. What you do makes a big difference on what people will do. Pedestrian issues. I was crossing the street in Salem going over to meet with the bike ped person, ironically, a few months ago, and there was an enormous street with 5 lanes of traffic, and there was no place for me to cross. And I mean, I would have had to walk quarter, half mile this way or quarter mile that way. And because I'm kind of a frustrated athlete, I just waited and I sprinted, and that's how I got across. But you really want to create infrastructure that makes it, ideally in a world that was really well designed, the default would be to bike somewhere, to walk somewhere, to carpool somewhere, to take transit somewhere. Because when you get into a car and you drive alone, you're creating much more pollution than if you were doing any of those other things. You're also creating health dynamics in yourself that don't just affect you. Did you know that people who take transit do significantly more walking in a given week than people who don't take transit? Common knowledge, or it could be more common knowledge. It's because you have to walk to and from a bus stop. Again, it affects your health, especially as the years go by. These things really add up. In 1 year, they're this big, but in a lifetime, and then you multiply that by the whole society that you're in, huge differences. Okay, so we had this 13-month campaign. Were we going to meet the goal? How are we going to measure whether or not we were reaching the goal? Well, my partner, Mike Krause, and I did a lot of thinking about this. And a lot of this we had to make up as we went along because this thing had not been done in the mall before. We looked at the public commitments. We had these hundreds of people who had said, I'm going to do this. Well, had they done it? We decided to ask them. We sent them a friendly follow-up email, and we said, how is it going? Tell us what you're up to, and is there anything we can do to help? And so a lot of them wrote back and said, yeah, I am doing it, or no, here's the problem I've ran into. Sometimes a carpool partner drops out. The thing that happens with people's transportation lives is that it's very complex. There's constant changes in what we're doing. This gentleman just said he would have ridden the bike today, but the weather didn't look quite right. So of course, we change like that all the time. A good transportation system is going to be able to offer these robust and consistent options. Here's the big mistake that we made, and I really believe in people learning from mistakes. We had a very sad Friday one day. Mike and I ran our numbers. People had gotten back to us with their whole commitment piece. We finally got clear enough on our spreadsheets that we weren't about to make the goal. I mean, it wasn't even going to be close. It was pathetic. And the reason that we had been so far off base, in our calculations, we had been figuring that if a person stopped driving alone and instead took the bus, in our calculations, we were thinking their carbon emissions come down to 0. No, that is so not true. Their carbon emissions are much more like, it really depends on how full the bus is. But that's one of those details that you're not going to be able to capture. So we finally went with about 65%. So the reduction from drive alone over to transit, the emissions are probably coming down about 35%. The only way that you get that reduction down to 0 is with what modes? Walk and bike, and possibly telework. Possibly telework. So we started to rerun our numbers, doing it accurately, instead of this utopian idea that if you change modes, your emissions become 0, and it was clear we were never going to make it. But we persisted in the campaign anyways. And then a really interesting thing happened. When we did the final survey at the end, after these 13 weeks of weekly emails, we did presentations, lots and lots of posters, you know, we worked hard, believe me. Here's what happened in the closing survey. We got a 40% response rate, which is good by any standard, not as big as the opening. We did have to let it be anonymous because it turned out that people were feeling very uncomfortable with their names. And so we went with anonymity, and that was fine. Here's what happened. Turned out that many, many more people had changed their trips than had publicly committed to doing it. That was happy for the people who were running the program. Any ideas? Any ideas on why people who were actually doing it wouldn't have chosen to commit? I don't even know the answer. I'm curious. Go ahead.
Maybe being afraid of being held accountable for their actions.
Good idea. Say more about that. I think you might be right. But tell us more.
I just said that I think some people are afraid to be held accountable for their actions, and when you actually write down what you're committed for, it's on paper like you've talked about, and I think people don't necessarily have the confidence in themselves to feel like they can make the change, and so they'd rather do it personally and make it kind of a personal goal than kind of broadcast it to all their employees, which, you know, maybe they hold more of a private life and they just don't really want all of their peers to know what they're working to do.
I think you make really good points. That sounds very sensible. Larry, go ahead.
There's also a fact that people may over-report their behavior and not really be doing it, especially with all the stuff that was going on then. There's something called the social desirability factor. People know that the right response is I'm telecommuting or I'm not driving as much or whatever, and that's and that's the response that you get, and it really distorts the kind of findings that you can get on surveys sometimes.
Agreed. I'll come back to that, but I want to hear from this gentleman also.
I wonder if that's as true in an anonymous survey. Another factor I was thinking was folks may have not chosen to commit at the beginning, but as they saw their peers using other methods, they may have decided to get on the bandwagon.
Yes, good points. Yeah, I think you're right. People are actually fairly notorious for fibbing about what they're doing and not doing. It does become more honest as anonymity comes into the picture. But I think it's also true that people get uncomfortable with not being congruent. They want to be congruent between what they say. So I think that you're right, that people didn't want to overcommit because it's pretty embarrassing and all the pressure. Go ahead. Dion? Is it Dion? Yes. Yeah.
Well, and maybe this is me being crazy, but I a lot of times don't like to commit to something because I would rather do more than they expect me to do than less. And so then I just don't even really talk about it and maybe surprise them in the end.
Well, thankfully there are a number of people like you, and that was what bailed us out and made the governor's challenge come out on paper successfully. Good points. Good points. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you check to see if there was an actual reduction in parking? And you said that it was hard.
Yeah, interesting question. Okay, so he's asking whether we checked on parking. The problem with summer, well, here's the upside and the downside of summer. Programs like these are virtually always done in summer or early fall because people aren't fighting the weather. They're much more likely to try something new. Downside is that things get skewed because everybody's going on vacation. And so with the reporting, in terms of our data, we feel like it was solid because we weren't asking them about the last week. We were asking them about the last week that they commuted. So when it comes to parking, it would have been skewed by vacations. But that actually is generally a really good measure of what people are up to. Look at those parking lots. Yeah, it's true. Okay. Okay. So I think I've covered a lot of the basics of social marketing. A real fundamental thing about social marketing is that it's labor intensive. It involves human beings doing things with each other. Now, a lot of the transportation world focuses on much higher technology things. Some of those are absolutely necessary. With social marketing, you're dealing with human beings doing all these communicative things. And you have to invest in some, like I had a full-time assistant. I got to have a full-time assistant for, well, overall a period of 6 months. Actually, it was a very inexpensive program. We looked at all the staff time and the cost of posters and so forth. $28,000 was what we came up with as the price of having reduced emissions by more than the goal. When we did all the data and we got a professional researcher so that, you know, any hopeful thinking on my part was out of the picture, we found that 593,000 pounds, I think that was 14% over the goal, maybe it was a little bit more than that, that was the reduction that we'd achieved. And what was the last point on that? Labor intensive. It was about people doing things. So it was very inexpensive. If you look at other programs that look to do things, I mean, they cost $28,000 is like a rounding error in terms of the ODOT budget. It is. It's a rounding error. Yeah. Go ahead.
What kind of permanent changes do you expect or hope to see, and do you plan on doing follow-up studies?
You know, good question. I really want to do follow-up. I love doing surveys. I love doing follow-up. It hasn't been authorized exactly. These things get really political, and I'll tell about another political part of it. But right now, legislative session is starting on Monday. And you don't expect, in the Capitol area, you don't expect to get anything else done during legislature session or even building up to it. In general, research around transportation options shows that a fairly significant percentage of people who have made a switch continue in some form of the behavior change. That's the typical one. Less so with bike and walk because they're more dependent on the weather. So at this point, there's probably, I'm wanting to just sort of take a wild guess in saying that 30 to 55% of the people who got into a carpool or who started transit are probably persisting in that pretty consistently. It's all about getting off the ground. You know, it's much harder to find a carpool and organize it than it is to then keep showing up to the organized carpool. Make sense? The biggest political hot potato, and I hadn't expected it. You know, you always run into surprises when you do a program. Teleworking is maybe not controversial, well, to you and me, but in the government world, it's especially controversial, and can you guess why? Can you guess why telework has a lot of charge around it? Yes?
The policy of open communication, some information may not be available to the public view.
Not the biggest problem, actually. Not the biggest one. A little bit similar to that. The taxpayers are very, you know, reactive sometimes about taxpayer money. Employees are paid with taxpayer money. The fear in general, not just with any one person in the system, is that the state government would come under criticism because, oh, those state workers are sitting around at home eating bonbons and watching TV when they should be actually at work working. They've actually done studies in general, and teleworkers, you can show productivity. You can show the accountability for the work. It varies tremendously from manager to manager. Some managers feel like they need to manage by physically watching the person. Other managers have the skills with which to manage people even though they're not in the same room with them. with telework, if you look at the stats for like the Portland-Salem commute, the carbon emissions reductions are so powerful if a person doesn't make that huge commute. Now, if they live 5 miles away from work, the carbon emissions reductions are fairly negligible. But of course, you can't have a policy that lets the long-distance commuters do this and not the short-distance. The policy has to be consistent. But it's very hard to get a manager to be willing to do it if there's not a higher level embracing of the concept of telework. We found that 10% of people in the Capitol Mall were teleworking. We asked for a lot of input. We wanted people's subjective verbal accounts of their commute. They had so much to say. I mean, I have literally thousands in the SurveyMonkey database. There are thousands of remarks about commuting. And people want, with a very powerful desire, not just to telework, but they want a compressed work week. They want a compressed work week and they want a telecommute. And 14% of the Capitol Mall employees surveyed were doing a compressed work week, which surprised me because I would have thought that more people would have been teleworking than doing a compressed work week. Does anybody have any ideas on the potential downsides of compressed work week? Any thoughts about problems, please?
You have children.
Tell more about that.
Most schools run from 8 to 3 if you're lucky, and if you can get extended care, then it's up to 5 or 6. But with an extended work week, your hours usually go beyond that 6 o'clock, and if there's any kind of activities afterwards, presents a lot of challenges.
I agree. And that's one reason that it surprises me that people want it so much. And then one of my carpool partners said, well, they just want to feel like they're working less. But a problem I see similar to you, if my husband does not have a compressed work week, then I end up with less time with him because I'm just away more. If I have children, and if they're not having a compressed work week, I see less of them because they're in school while I'm suddenly having this day off. And so that's the social side. On the carbon emission reduction side, what do you think a person does if they have a new day off? You probably, do some driving around. You do other things too. But I disagree with any data that looks at compressed work week as an absolute, we took those emissions out of the mix. The employer might have just outsourced those carbon emissions to the other sector. So I have a lot of critical thinking around compressed work week, although people like it. You could get energy savings if you can shut down the whole building for that Friday. Then, yeah, you're coming out ahead on the energy mix. But that's not what typically happens because you have to have a skeleton staff. Yeah. So those are actually very controversial issues, the compressed work week and the telework. Yes?
Wouldn't it also cause problems during construction, especially since all construction's done by private contractors? If they work 5 days a week and you work 4, that wouldn't work out.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that part. Say that again, because I'm not immediately getting it.
Well, say you're an inspector and you're inspecting construction projects. If you work 4 days a week and the constructor works 5, there's a day that either they can't work or no one's going to be out there.
Right. So you're impacting a lot of other people's schedules. You can do this schedule, but other things might get held up because you're not available to work that day. That's a good point. Okay. Yes?
So what did you conclude about the influence of gas prices?
It's very influential. Gas prices are very influential. I mean, these things are so wrapped together. The social marketing techniques that we used would have worked to some degree if gas prices had been low to moderate. But they worked very powerfully in combination with high gas prices. It was, high gas prices make an enormous difference. Yes?
What kind of breakdown do you see as far as for the people who are shifting in, transportation modes, bicycling?
Good question. Good question. The bicyclists doubled. Now, part of that you could chalk up to weather because the baseline had been established at the end of May. On the other hand, some people would have already been bicycling because it was warm enough. The bicyclists doubled. We can look at the graph. I'll try to draw with my body the graph. The carpoolers were by far the biggest jump. It was a big jump. Like, oh, it was a huge jump. The context for the carpooling jumping is that you look at the state of Oregon, you look at any state in the nation, by far the biggest single transportation option being used out of all the possible ones is carpooling. It's a relatively small percentage of the nation's population that lives within transit use. So carpooling was the biggest jump. Transit took a sizable jump. Bicycling went from, was it either from 5 to 10 or 3 to 6%? It doubled. Walking increased. Van pooling is not very many people, but the demand for van pools, my desk actually subsidizes van pools. The demand was over the roof. They had to start a bunch of new van pools. There were waiting lists. People couldn't get into van pools. I always tell a person, if you can't get into a van pool, work with a carpool, because carpools are very fluid and readily available. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
What was the walking increase?
Oh, see, this is where I wish that my ODOT VPN worked better. I don't have it in my memory, but it increased. Yeah. Chris?
So we have a couple web questions. I'll just read one of them. Do you have any thoughts on at what point you can remove the incentives, such as the free transit pass, and still see behavior change?
Oh, that is such an intriguing question. There's no single answer, but here's a new program, a pilot that I'm funding, because I think that I sense the answer. In the city of Bend, van pools aren't working especially well because you'd have to have a lot of people, and they just have a lower density. What we're trying instead with those rideshare dollars is incentivized high-volume carpools, and we're doing it only for 3 months. The van pool subsidy is pretty much open-ended until that round of funds, so people get the van pool subsidy ongoing. What I'm doing is experimenting with Jeff Monson, really, really dynamic director of commute options. Okay, long story short, if you get into a carpool of 3 or more people, we will give you, it's a range of $50 to $80 per month as incentive. You can only do it for 3 months. After that, you're on your own. The theory is that you will continue to do it after that 3 months because you're saving gas. There's social benefits. You can read or work while you're in the carpool. So that's my guess. My guess is that after we remove the incentive, 3 months afterwards, I think they'll continue to do it. And we're going to do the research to find out if they do. Yes?
I was wondering what methods you use to get people to arrange carpools. I mean, I know there's a website like Carpool Northwest. Is that what they used? Or were
Good
there
question.
other?
Carpool Match Northwest, I highly recommend it. It's how I found my carpool, and I think that my carpool is the best one in the state of Oregon. It's a very, very cool carpool. Salem Area Mass Transit District, Chariots, they also have a carpool matching database. I'm also in that database. Ironically, a fairly good number of carpools happen not through those databases, although many do, but it's largely people like you and me who sit around in the same classroom and say, hey, let's try riding to work together. So a lot of it is under the radar and informal. So it's a both and between the official databases and informal social interactions.
Along those lines, I was interested in your thoughts on sort of peer-to-peer recruitment. I know
Very powerful.
Anecdotally, I'm a bike commuter, and in various workplaces where I've worked, people have come up and said, you make me feel guilty for driving my car, or something along those lines.
How do you respond to that? Out of curiosity, what's your verbal response?
I usually don't say, I'm trying to make you feel guilty. I just say it's the choice that I made, and that I'd be happy to, help them make that choice too. Or
that's a beautiful response. Can I help?
Yeah,
can I help?
With a lot of times it's assisting with finding the best route to ride, for example. And I'm kind of curious, if you have thoughts about how that peer-to-peer recruitment can be facilitated by someone like ODOT.
Yeah. It's true that peer-to-peer is the way that most transportation options actually happen. The bus, people usually need help getting onto a bus. They feel embarrassed and shy. They need somebody to say, hey, let's ride the bus together. Here's our fare. It goes like this. Here's your little token. Yeah, we're going to get off here. People are very afraid that they'll go miles past their stop. They need the help. I think that the high volume carpooling, I mean, it's very much something that people have to do together. That's one way to do it. Bicycle Transportation Alliance. Any members of BTA in here? Yeah. Anybody go to the Alice B. Toe Clips Awards? I do too. They are very strong on that whole social thing. I mean, they have people who live to bike. What is it? Bike, work to live to bike, bike to work, something like that. They love it. They will help you. So I think that there's a lot of people that will help a person to get a choice beyond driving alone. And it's it's a make or break. It's a make or break. You do have to have the peer-to-peer. I don't know all the answers yet on how you help it to happen. You can't legislate it exactly, but you can certainly incent people to take the step. Go ahead.
The Smart Trips Downtown program that Transportation Options has in conjunction with Keep Portland Moving, with all the transit mall mess that's being cleaned up, thank you. Experimented with a bike, advocates for bikes, bike champions is what they call it. And basically they use their email database to say, okay, who bikes regularly, who would be interested in talking with their coworkers? And then they had just a couple of meetings with those folks and then gave them incentives to, help their coworkers. And many people did it, as you said, just because they're passionate about it. And they found a pretty big increase in the number of bike trips just by having those folks in the workplace. And so they self-selected and they're the best people to do it.
It's very contagious. As you told that good account, behavior is very contagious. Actually, emotions are also contagious, but behavior is very measurably contagious, which goes along with the whole social norming and with what our PDOT colleague here is talking about. People infect each other with behaviors, both healthy and unhealthy. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering how much of the overall amount of carbon emissions does 500,000 pounds represent?
Yeah.
In the city or even the state? And
good question.
Cost effective, to spend $28,000, $30,000
Mm-hmm.
for 500,000 pounds.
I had a graph that showed that if you annualized it, it was like this. The idea was that this was a pilot. What we realized was that here was what we had accomplished. If it was annualized with just these people, it was this. If you took 5% of state employees, it's the biggest employer in Oregon, it's 55,000 employees statewide. If we were to have expanded the pilot, convinced 5% of the entire state employee population to make a similar change, it would have been an enormous thing. So I think it is cost effective. Yes?
Have you maintained contact with participants regarding continued travel behaviors or some form of encouragement?
Yeah, this gentleman just asked whether we've maintained contact. If I were authorized to do that in my job, absolutely. It was a pilot, and my core work is grant management, and so I haven't been sent forth to do that. Ideally, we could and would. State employees have a fairly high retention rate, and so if I was authorized to do a similar program again soon, it would be pretty easy to see what the follow-up retention rate had been. So it's still doable. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question.
So there's a niche for bus advocacy.
Yes.
Anybody here wants to join me in being a bus advocate in the
I'm a very enthusiastic and long-time user of TriMet myself, and I think that public transit is a wonderful thing, and TriMet does a good job on the whole.
Okay, well, before we thank Alison for her presentation today, I want to announce next week's seminar. It's the Willamette River Crossing by Dave Unsworth and Guinevere Millis. Dave's from TriMet, and Guinevere Millis is from SRM Architecture. So with that, thank you very much, Alison.
It's been a pleasure.
If you're a student, you might want to check to make sure that I got your question down. If you didn't have time to ask the question, you can write one out. You can put it in the folder.
Hi.
Hi, anyways, and I don't drive because I'm really blind, so
okay.
I like